In the 15th century BC, a depraved sexual nature had festered in the minds of many pagans, which was a desire to seek sexual gratification with animals. The faithful Israelite man or woman was to never commit the sin of bestiality. If a man or woman was discovered to be having sexual relations with animals, he or she was to be handed over to the court of 23 judges. If 16 of the 23 judges convicted the man or woman on witness, testimony, and evidence, he or she would be stoned, as well as the animal. Leviticus 18:23. If the Israelites defiled the land by practicing sexual immorality, they would be cut off from the nation. Furthermore, Adonai promised that the land would vomit them out. The fifth commandment clearly speaks of children having the responsibility of paying honor to their parents, as is recorded in Exodus 20:12. However, Leviticus 19:3 is a similar commandment in wording. Every one of you is to revere his father and mother, and you are to keep my Shabbat. I am Adonai, your God. The Hebrew word for revere also means fear, which resulted in the KJV rendering it as, ye shall fear every man his mother and his father, and keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. The widow, the orphan, the Levite, and the foreigner were allotted the corners of the field to harvest and the gleanings to gather. While harvesting grains or grapes, there were frequent times when some of the grain or grapes would fall to the ground. These fallen grains or grapes were the gleanings of the field or vineyard and were not to be gathered. Leviticus 19:9-10. People were never to swear falsely in court, though in context it dealt with witness testimony in a criminal or civil case. The principle also covered loans and credit as well. Per Leviticus 19:11, no one was to swear falsely regarding a monetary claim by denying the claim. Per Leviticus 19:13, the employer was not to deprive his employee of his wages or on payday. An Israelite was expected not to curse, hate, humiliate, or gossip about another upright member of the community. Leviticus 19:14-16-17. Part of humiliating a fellow member of the community would be giving someone harmful advice. Another thing which would cause embarrassment is for someone to put a stumbling block in the path of a blind person, though this could potentially result in murder depending on circumstances. A third part is cursing a deaf person who cannot defend himself against the accusations. Leviticus 18:22-19:14. Even though their ancestors came up from Egypt, they were no different from the Philistines, who were from Kephator or Aram, who came from Kerf or Ker. For its sins, Adonai would completely eradicate the kingdom of Samaria, shaking it and dispersing them among all the Gentiles as grains are strained through a sieve. This was done to purify the sinners who thought they would escape judgment. The time would come when the fallen tabernacle of David would be raised up and restored. The land would be bountiful and the fortunes replenished. The cities would be rebuilt and gardens and vineyards planted. Once it was restored, what would be left of the Gentile nations and Edom would be overtaken. Amos 9:15 sums up what the restoration would be like by these words stated by the King of the universe. I will plant them on their own soil, no more to be uprooted from their land, which I gave them. Amos 9:7-15. Paul would refuse to speak to these, or that the king wills him to visit again, but would take note of their influence. He not only questioned if he will come there peacefully or correct them himself, but also addressed the metropolis about a particular Christian engaging in sins that were taboo from the perspective of the pagans, and that an excommunication be issued against him. Paul hoped that by the metropolis doing so, that the man would repent outside of communion so that his soul could be saved in the end. Transitioning to the arrogant pride of the metropolis, Paul used the Jewish bread-making techniques and Pesach customs as an example of how arrogant pride can fester and poison the faith. On Nisan the 13th, all observant Jewish families look for hummus or yeast and remove it so they can only make unleavened bread and dough from Nisan 15th to the 21st per Exodus 12:21-51, 13:17-15:26, Leviticus 22:26 through 23:44, and Deuteronomy 15:19-16:17. Hummus is also a symbol of arrogant pride. Paul instructed the metropolis to remove the old arrogant pride as Christians through Christ, who is the true and sacrificed paschal lamb, are unleavened in reality. In Jewish bread making, a piece of hummus from one batch of dough is used to ferment other batches of dough. This could increase the risk of food contamination, which shows that arrogant pride can poison a person's faith. Therefore, the Christian should remove all traces of arrogant pride, the yeast of wickedness and evil, for his spiritual health. He must instead mediate and spiritually consume the matzah of purity and truth. Transitioning to the sexual immorality, drunkenness, abusiveness, greed, theft, and idolatry practiced in the metropolis by alleged Christians, Paul instructed devout Christians not to do anything to do with them, or to not have anything to do with them. The metropolis was supported by Deuteronomy 13:6 or verse 5, 17:7, 12, 19:19, 21:21, 22:21, 24, and 24:7, instructed to not judge the sinner by the same standard as the Christian. Expounding on this, Paul instructed that the Christian should bring his complaint against another before the elders and presbyter of his parish instead of the secular court system. As all the redeemed will judge fallen angels, they should be able to judge in matters of the everyday life of the Christian. 1 Corinthians 5, 1-13. Paul, initially wanting peace between them and himself, wrote the metropolis 2 letters. He hoped that these 2 letters would aim them in electing the right course of righteous conduct. However, like our Father who has exhausted his patience, knows that he must correct these Christians as a child needs to be corrected. he states that if anyone has harmed them in words, it has been a man in the metropolis whose name is not worth mentioning. As this man has repented, he has not been forgiven, encouraged, or comforted by the bishops or the presbytery. When Paul wrote them, he wanted to test them to see if they would forgive just as easily as they would judge, so they would not be taken advantage of by dark supernatural forces. 2 Corinthians 2, 1-11.